Welcome back to Moby Dick, Chapter 42. This is the Whiteness of the Whale. In the previous chapter, Moby Dick, Ishmael explained to us how it is that Ahab's mission became his own. And we talked a bit about how, by a kind of literary transitive property, we can go from saying that Ishmael is Ahab, and Ahab is the crew, or Ishmael is the crew, therefore Ahab is the crew, and Ahab is the whale, therefore Ishmael is the whale. That's kind of what's hanging out there at the end of the chapter. In the Whiteness of the Whale, Ishmael sets out to say that, I tried to explain what this hunt meant to Ahab in the last chapter, but I haven't exactly clarified what it is that it means to me personally. And in this chapter, he doesn't exactly make it clear again. However, I think that he tries very hard to, and I think that it is what he does not say that is perhaps most illustrative of what he means. We've discussed that Ahab is the whale. And for that discussion, I recommend that you go back and listen to the last podcast if you didn't. But basically, in the first initial meeting of Ahab and the whale, when the whale took Ahab's leg, the whale became part of Ahab, and Ahab became part of the whale. Ishmael, chapter 42 is really interesting in its structure, because we've got our narrator Ishmael, but he starts talking or using techniques very similar to what our sub-librarian narrator has done. He continues to bring forth examples of other people, even if they're irrelevant. He brings them up. But in case we get too comfortable with the notion that, in fact, Ishmael is our sub-librarian, which I considered in the last chapter, in this chapter we have footnotes. And these footnotes disagree with what Ishmael is saying. There's an example where Ishmael describes the presence of an albatross near the boat, and this completely terrifies him. He thinks that it is the embodiment of dread, whereas the narrator, or whoever it is who's writing the footnotes these days, the narrator says that no, the albatross is a sign of wonder and divinity surrounding the boat. It is the most exceptional thing ever. So we've got our dueling narrators and we've got dueling meanings. And we've been talking all along about how Melville, or somebody, whoever's telling this story really, is trying to have it every which way. He's doing everything that he can to leave open and reasonable every possible interpretation of what's going on here. From this guy's eaten too many magic mushrooms and he's hallucinating and telling something completely insane, or, this is an allegory, God forbid, or, we've got multiple narrators with different points of view and who's talking. I don't know. I continue to lean towards this notion that we've got multiple points of view or multiple personalities, but they're all the same narrator. Let me explain a little bit more. We've got Ishmael is like Ahab. Work with me on this. Ahab is like the whale. Ishmael is like the whale. Ishmael himself is the whale. With the dueling narrators, and multiple points of view and levels of knowledge about people's motives and what they've been doing, Melville maintains this uncertainty of the identity of the speaker and the accuracy of the story being told, as well as this amazing amount of confusion about who we're supposed to believe and who we're supposed to side with. Exactly what are we supposed to make of this story? Who's right? It's as though there is ubiquity in the meaning in this story. Just like in the last chapter, Ishmael was talking about the ubiquity of the whale, the immortality of the whale. Moby Dick is everywhere at all times, and he exists in all times, at all times, and he always has. which also means that whether it's Ahab or Ishmael or the sub-librarian or somebody else, they have always and will always exist everywhere also. And this grand battle between the hunter and the whale, whoever they both may be, is actually an epic internal battle between the wild and the free, and the safe and landed, between what is civilized and what is savage, and we don't know which is which. We're not even sure that we can clearly decide. And that is the horror of the whiteness of the whale. Depending on your context, white is either divine and clean and beautiful and pure and noble and even godlike, or it is the embodiment of hell and perversion and terror all in one. And here we're starting to bring forward the idea that maybe those ideas are not mutually exclusive. Maybe the fight, even in its futility, is still unavoidable. I want to go to the very end of the chapter of the whiteness of the whale. In my book, this starts on page 211. Ishmael is discussing various hypothetical situations about wild animals who have never seen various predators, and yet still, when they hear the roar or they see the sight of one for the first time, they know that it is terrifying. And he challenges us, the reader or the listener, who might be questioning whether or not he's overreacting. And Ishmael pushes back, and he says, "No, but here thou beholdest, even in a dumb brute, the instinct of the knowledge of demonism in the world. Though thousands of miles from Oregon, still when he smells that savage musk, the rending, goring bison herds are as present as to the deserted wild foal of the prairies, which this instant they may be trampling into dust. Thus, then, the muffled rollings of a milky sea, the bleak rustlings of the festooned frost of the mountains, the desolate shiftings of the windrowed snows of prairies, all these, to Ishmael, are as the shaking of that buffalo robe to the frightened colt. Though neither knows where lie the nameless things of which the mystic sign gives forth such hints, yet with me, as with the colt, somewhere those things must exist. Though in many of its aspects this visible world seems formed in love, though in many of its aspects this visible world seems formed in love, the invisible spheres were formed in fright. But not yet have we solved the incantation of this whiteness, and learned why it appeals with such power to the soul, and more strange and far more pretentious, why, as we have seen, is it at once the most meaning symbol of spiritual things, nay, the very veil of the Christian's deity, and yet should be, as it is, the intensifying agent in things the most appalling to mankind? Is it that by its indefiniteness it shadows forth the heartless voids and immensities of the universe, and thus stabs us from behind with the thought of annihilation, while beholding the white depths of the Milky Way? Or is it that as in essence whiteness is not so much a color as the visible absence of color, and yet at the same time the concrete of all colors? Is it for these reasons that there is such a dumb blankness, full of meaning, in a wide landscape of snows, a colorless, all color of atheism from which we shrink? And when we consider that other theory of the natural philosophers, that all other earthly hues, every stately or lovely emblazoning, the sweet tinges of sunset skies and woods, and yea, the gilded velvets of butterflies, and the butterfly cheeks of young girls, all these are but subtle deceits, not actually inherent in substances, but only laid on from without, so that all deified nature absolutely paints like the harlot, whose allurements cover nothing but the charnel house within. And when we proceed further, and consider that the mystical cosmetic which produces every one of her hues, the great principle of light, forever remains white or colorless in itself, and if operating without medium upon matter would touch all objects, even tulips and roses, with its own blank tinge. Pondering all this, the palsied universe lies before us like a leper, and like willful travelers in Lapland who refuse to wear colored and coloring glasses upon their eyes. So the wretched infidel gazes himself blind at the monumental white shroud that wraps all the prospect around him. And of all these things the albino whale was the symbol. Wonder ye then at the fiery hunt.